Welcome back. This is near the end of my Winter 2017 series. I'm Raj Kletke, and today we'll be tying and fishing the eighth and final fly of this series, a slight variation of Gary LaFontaine's Sparkle Pupa. LaFontaine tied two forms of the Sparkle Pupa, an emerger form and a deep form. We'll be tying just the emerger form, which is one of the best, if not the best pattern to use during most caddis emergences. We'll discuss the deep Sparkle Pupa only briefly. The major differences are listed here for completeness, but I tie mainly just the emerger form. We'll be discussing the materials further before actual tying, but let's first look at what we're trying to represent. This is called a Sparkle Pupa, a convention we'll be using also, but as you might recall, this is actually a ferret adult in a tight sheath that, with most caddis species, will fill with gas to buoy the ferret adult to the surface. If you don't recognize these terms, you may want to review my Simple Entomology series on caddis before you start tying. The Caddis 2, Part 8 of that series, covers this terminology and also has a video on tying the Emerger Sparkle Pupa, which is slightly different from the way we'll be tying it today. As the sheath fills with gas, it separates from the body of the ferret adult and is represented by the overbody of the Sparkle Pupa. In my Simple Entomology series, I tied the Sparkle Pupa with the overbody of Antron yarn that comes on a spool as seen on the left. It fished okay, but I now prefer the Sparkle yarn, still an Antron yarn that Gary LaFontaine tied the originals with. This is seen in the middle. It may not actually be any better, but the Sparkle yarn looks better to me, so I fish it more and with greater confidence, hence I catch more trout with it. Some also use Antron dubbing for the underbody, but I prefer making my own touch dubbing, as I'll show you shortly. The actual pupa sheath is transparent, so it might make sense to use clear Antron yarn for the overbody as long as you keep it sparse enough to let the underbody color show through. Some in fact do this, but the original Sparkle Pupa had colored overbodies, and I still used colored overbodies. I use mainly green and tan, which cover most of the Brachycentrus and Hydropsyche caddis that I fish. I did experiment and tried different colors during a tan Hydropsyche caddis emergence. The green caught just as many trout, so maybe the color isn't that important. Maybe LaFontaine was right about the adhering gas bubbles being the important feature. In the past, I used an Antron dubbing in the usual fashion, but if adhering gas bubbles really are important, Antron touch dubbing, like LaFontaine recommended, do seem to hold adherent bubbles better, so now I make my own. I hold a clump of sparkle yarn fibers and cut off pieces 1/8 of an inch or shorter. LaFontaine's original touch dubbing was a mixture of fine fur and chopped sparkle yarn. I skipped the fine fur and mixed colored and clear Antron yarn in variable proportions. I doubt the proportions are of any real importance. If you catch the chopped yarn on a creased piece of paper, you can easily pour the chopped yarn into a cheap coffee blender, an item which we did discuss earlier in this series. The blender makes a nice mixture ready to use. Put some extra dubbing into a well-labeled small plastic bag for future use. Don't forget to label the bag, or you end up in a couple of years with some specially prepared dubbing like this that I forgot what I originally made it for. Finally, we're ready to tie a Sparkle Pupa emerger. Use a standard dry fly hook and tie some 14s and 16s in green and tan. You can add other sizes and colors later if needed. Note that with this fly, I intentionally left the front half to 2/3 of the hook shank bare of thread. I split the sparkle yarn into its 4 strands and split one of these strands even further and tie this in like a tail. This isn't really a tail, but represents part of the gas-filled sheath that is splitting off. In fact, the classic way to make this tail is to cut the front of a few fibers from the finished overbody and bend it back. I do it both ways, but I feel it is easier at first to tie it in like a tail. Leave it long now and you'll see why shortly. I then tie in the overbody yarn on the bare hook shank that I left. The bare hook helps me to distribute the fibers somewhat around the hook shank. I use about 1.5 strands on a size 14 hook and 1 strand on a size 16. Some separate the fine fibers from the strands before tying in. I tie in the yarn and then separate the fine fibers before bringing the strands back. I use a bodkin to pick them apart, but you can use a bodkin, a comb, or a toothbrush. See what works best for you. As you bring the strands of yarn back, keep it around the hook shank as best possible. At least keep it split into the two sides. Carry it just slightly down the hook bend, and then put the tackiest dubbing wax you have on your thread. Don't try to just use water or saliva. I take a small pinch of dubbing that I made and literally just touch it to the waxed thread. This will leave just a small amount of very fine dubbing on the thread, which when wound on the hook gives a very loose, somewhat spiky, and almost translucent appearance to the underbody. Tie off about a quarter from the front of the hook, still leaving the rest of the hook shank bare. Having left the tail long allows you to keep it separate from the overbody as you pull the overbody forward to the front of the underbody. Try to keep the overbody yarn distributed around the hook shank as you put two loose wraps in place. There are multiple techniques for this next step. I find it easiest most of the time to use my bodkin to pull a few fibers at a time out to form the overbody bubble. I have the overbody bubble's height fill about half of the hook gap. I like the overbody bubble fairly sparse and evenly distributed around the hook. If you don't like the distribution, just unwrap the two thread wraps, pull the overbody tight again, and start over. Once you're happy with the sparseness and distribution of the overbody, cut off the excess yarn from the tail and tie off and trim the excess yarn from the front. The tail should be no longer than the body. Ideally, the overbody is sparse enough to see through it to the underbody. Stack some hair fibers for a wing using a little less than you would for an elk hair caddis, and tie those fibers in on top just like you would for an elk hair caddis. Trim the excess hair base. Don't leave it long like the elk hair caddis. You can do this either after tying it in or use the pre-cut method that I like and used in tying the elk hair caddis in my Simple Entomology series. Then cover this over with thread. For the head, you can use marabou fibers. With both green and tan bodies, I use brown, gray, or black marabou. I usually use the chenille method, which I did explain in my beginning fly tying series, to reinforce the marabou and then wrap the marabou to the eye and tie off. I like the look of this head, and once wet, the marabou may actually even give some micro movement, another feature in flies that I like. However, I do have more color choices with regular dubbing in the tans and browns that I like. If you use a dry fly dubbing, it may actually help keep the fly's head floating in the surface film better also, but I also like spiky wet fly dubbings. All head styles seem to work, so use what you like best. Well, it's time to fish the sparkle pupa. It is a fly made specifically to be fished before and during the caddis emergence, which is common, but may be difficult to recognize. If you know what the caddis are doing, how to fish the sparkle pupa is obvious. If you haven't already, now's a good time to review the 3 videos from my Simple Entomology series on caddis, and perhaps the caddis parts of my Fly Fishing Hatches series also. You really have to know about pre-emergent and emergent caddis hatches to fish the sparkle pupa correctly. It is well worth your time. Caddis larvae are common in the drift, so are excellent searching flies, but we're discussing when to fish the sparkle pupa. So we're concentrating on the pre-emergent and emergent caddis hatches. The most common genera of caddis I fish are the Brachycentrus and Hydropsyche. These pupa leave their cases near the bottom of the stream. Now they're technically ferret adults in a sheath, but we still call them pupa. They drift near the bottom for a variable period of time. Gas forms and expands the sheath, causing the pupa, sometimes together with active swimming, to ultimately rise to the surface. And they then again drift subsurface or in the surface for a while before the final emergence. So while the caddis pupa are drifting near the bottom, fishing them deep, much like a searching nymph, is reasonable. When the pupa are rising to the surface, a lift, which is just basically stopping your line and letting the pupa swing up, is reasonable. When subsurface or in the surface, fishing shallow is right. When fishing deep, the deep sparkle pupa is logical, but I usually just fish the Emergent Sparkle Pupa as a dropper off a heavily weighted searching nymph or add weight to the tippet. The fish don't really seem to care. If adherent air bubbles are important, as I think they are, use a desiccant frequently, which will be helpful to keep the fly dry. Based on what happened the day before or previous history, I'll start fishing deep an hour or more before a suspected caddis hatch. Use the sparkle pupa as a dropper off my favorite searching nymph is what I usually do. When I see a few scattered rises, I'll take off any excess weight and switch to fishing the sparkle pupa rising to the surface or fish it shallow. When fishing shallow, you can fish the sparkle pupa upstream or downstream like a dry fly with dead drift, or swing it like a wet fly. I usually find I do best if I fish it just slightly subsurface. Since many caddis emergences will be in riffles, it may be difficult to see strikes on a subsurface fly. Sometimes it helps to use an X-caddis as a point fly to serve as an indicator, and occasionally the trout will prefer the X-caddis. Some genera and species vary from the common pattern of emergence I just described. Learning the species on your water and close observation is the best approach. Some of this is covered a little more in my 2 previous series. Do remember that the direction of movement may be important, so swing your fly towards shore. In selected settings, especially post-emergent caddis hatches, other patterns may be more appropriate than the sparkle pupa, so you do want to carry X-caddis and L-caddis patterns also. Well, we've now covered and fished all 8 flies intended for the winter of the 2017 series. I'll be doing one more quick video to briefly summarize what we covered and perhaps make a few additional suggestions for this next fishing season. I'm Raj Kletke, and I'll see you soon.